You expect ruins to be quiet. You expect broken walls and chipped pottery and the polite hush of museums where glass cases frame things that once moved and breathed. But step off the beaten track in the high plateaus and fog-wrapped valleys of historic Armenia and the world insists on being louder than you planned. Stones that refuse to be anonymous. Rocks that carry names and teeth and wings in their weathered faces. Here, in fields where shepherds still count the hours by the sun and the foxes remember old paths, there are standing slabs, carved, placed, and sometimes defaced, that locals call dragon stones. They are not the fanciful props of fairy tales. They are the stubborn witnesses to rituals that could stretch back 6,000 years or more. And if you come expecting tidy answers, expect to be surprised. The more we dig, date, and debate, the more the margins of our knowledge glow with questions. We'll promise you a series of revelations and more than a few uncomfortable uncertainties. Because these stones, and the people who built around them, sit at an intersection of archaeology, myth, and human longing. We will walk the fields together, peer into cave mouths, read chipped glyphs and whispered oral histories, and at every turn weigh what we can measure against what we can only imagine. Somewhere between carbon dates and folklore, between trade routes and night fires, we will find the reasons to care. This is not a story about dragons as monsters but dragons as memory, embodied, ritualized, and stubbornly alive in stone. So keep this image in the foreground, fog clinging to the fields, goats slowing somewhere out of sight, drums echoing through the night as a circle of people moves around a carved monolith. Now keep that image, because almost everything we think we know about these places bends toward making sense of precisely that seeing. We will not pretend the map is complete. Instead, we will follow the faint tracks, read the scratches, and invite you to imagine what the builders intended, and then to consider what their actions still mean for us. We will talk about dates and data and competing theories. We will not shy away from sensational accounts of giants and cursed stones, because the myths themselves are evidence of a human impulse worth dissecting. Above all, we'll try to keep our feet on the ground even as our voices carry across millennia. Archaeology asks for careful steps and patient observation, and wonder asks for imagination. Together, you and I will hold both. Picture the first time a scholar brushed away the last layer of windblown soil and found a dragon's profile peeking through millennia of sediment, an azimuth of carved eyes, a snout in low relief, scales traced by an artisan's hand. The pocket of loam did what loam does: it kept, it preserved, it muffled. Radiocarbon tests would later put a date on charcoal from fires nearby. Pottery sherds in the burial trench would hint at connections to distant trade routes. But in that initial moment, the stones simply spoke. That's where stories begin, not with a clean narrative but with a shard of something asking to be heard. Around these stones, we will find traces of feasting and fasting, of animal bones laid with funerary care, of tiny beads and large, blunt tools. These are not merely ornamental. Across a dozen sites the pattern repeats. The stones sit not at roadways but at thresholds, at places where the living encountered the other world, where journeys began and ended. Some stones are clearly astronomical in orientation, others mark water sources or the edge of communal grazing lands. Still others are placed beside caves known to hold ochre stains and handprints. We'll meet local elders who can recite an untranslatable line of a chant, and watch them falter when asked whether the dragons are benevolent. You will notice attention. The thin, rational voice of dating methods and pottery typology insists on timelines and cultural continuity. The thicker, human voice in the valleys insists on meaning. Both are right, and both are partial. As we go, you'll hear fragments of the grander story, that these stones were not static monuments but functioned as nodes in a network. Ritual nodes, navigational markers, social anchors. They were part of a long-lived conversation between people and place, and that conversation is still ongoing. One site, Caravan's quieter cousin, an upland ring of stones some 15 kilometers from the better-known observatory, offers a single-sentence riddle, a small circle of muscle-bound slabs, each engraved with a reptilian eye, stands at the mouth of a valley and asks us why the same motif appears in sites separated by rivers and ridgelines. Archaeological survey here showed that the stone circle sits on a natural terrace overlooking a now dry streambed. When the little river ran, it carried flints and grains and news. When it did not, people brought offerings. Excavations in the terrace layers revealed wheel-made pottery fragments and a scatter of obsidian blades whose source, when traced with geochemical analysis, pointed to regions hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of long-distance exchange and, with it, the movement of ideas. Radiocarbon samples from burned offerings underneath one stone cluster suggest activity as early as the 4th millennium BC, while stylistic analysis of the carvings hints at successive recarvings across centuries. But here's where it gets tricky. Some scholars see in the repetitive eye motif an astronomical calendar, an index of seasonal shifts marked by the sun's rising over fixed stones, whereas others argue the eye is instead an apotropaic, protective, symbol guarding cemetery plots and pasture boundaries. Yet another school suggests the eye is a clan emblem, a totem marking territorial identity for pastoral groups who moved seasonally through these valleys. Mythic accounts add spice. Villagers tell of a night when a dragon, more serpent than monstrous beast, slew a rival chieftain and was then carved into stone by the chieftain's mourning widow. Oral variants speak of lost tribes who were guided by dragon stones to a refuge beyond a glacier. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, your boots sinking into dew, the carved eye gleaming with condensate as a shepherd crosses with his flock. You are navigating a landscape saturated with memory and bodily practice. Still, for all the evidence, charcoal dates, obsidian signatures, repeated motifs, we still don't know whether the circle began as an astronomical instrument, a clan marker, or something else wholly unanticipated. Another site, a single colossal slab dubbed by local schoolchildren the Great Dragon Tooth, set upright on a limestone outcrop where the Gegum winds carve the sky, offers a one-line teaser that's equal parts threat and invitation. This stone's carved fangs face the high road, as if warding off those who would pass by. The scale of the carving is striking, nearly 3 meters tall, with incisions so deep they cast shadows like teeth. When archaeologists surveyed the outcrop, they found terraced soils behind the slab and post holes that suggested a wooden palisade once ringed part of the plateau. Charred seed remains in a refuse pit gave us domesticated barley dates consistent with the early Bronze Age, while isotopic analysis of nearby skeletal remains suggested a diet mixing meat and cultivated grains, evidence of a community in transition from mobile pastoralism to more settled agriculture. Trade artifacts, bronze fragments and beads made from marine shells, hinted at connections down to the Black Sea littoral. Now, let's be fair, a defensive reading of the site makes sense. The slab's face looks outward, the palisade would have offered protection, and the strategic plateau commands a valley. Yet there is another interpretation. This could be a ritual boundary marker, the ceremonial tooth of a mythic beast that guards the threshold between the living fields and the ancestral cave below. David, an elder who grew up nearby, swears his grandmother told him that on certain moonless nights you can hear the stone sigh, like a wind through bone. Skeptical archaeologists will note that wind through fluted stone makes such sounds. Storytellers will reply that nature and myth are not mutually exclusive. Imagine yourself climbing the plateau at dusk, wind combing your hair, the great slab's carved teeth catching the last light and throwing the valley into a deep chiaroscuro. The scene collapses defense, ceremony, and legend into one sensorial package. Still, for all the stratigraphy and the finds, we still don't know whether the Great Dragon Tooth began as a watchtower or as the central axis of a ritual complex. Then there's the cave shrine beneath the Armenian ridge. One sentence and a throat-tightening image. A narrow entrance leads to ochre-smeared walls and a low stone altar, where tiny carved serpents curl like sleeping children. The cave is a microclimate, cool in summer, damp in winter, its mouth swallowing daylight until only the inner chamber is left for torchlight and breath. Excavations in the inner gallery uncovered residues in cracked pottery that chemical analysis identified as the earliest known wine in this highland arc, some samples pushing beyond 6,000 years before present, alongside small bone pins, copper beads, and a carefully arranged assemblage that suggested a ritual meal. The carvings of serpents along the altar's rim are small but deliberate. Each coil ends in a stylized curl that repeats across objects found in household contexts around the valley, hinting at a shared symbolic language. Several competing theories attempt to explain the cave's function. One view treats it as an ancestral cult site where fermented drink was shared with the departed. Another sees it as a storage and production site for alcohol whose ritualized consumption was part of community feasting. A third suggests it was a liminal space used by initiates undergoing rites of passage, entering the cave, partaking in the ferment, and emerging as full members of a group. Then there are the more sensational local stories of giant skeletons unearthed in the cave mouths in the old days, bones that were too large for ordinary humans and carried teeth like those carved on the stones. Skeletal claims rarely hold up to osteological scrutiny, but they do matter. They signal the human need to remythologize history, to make the past larger than ourselves. Picture yourself crawling into that narrow entrance with a lantern, watching dust motes swim in the beam as the smell of old tannins and earth rises, like stepping into an archive of breath and time. Still, for all the residue analysis and contextual finds, we still don't know whether the primary purpose of the cave was ritual initiation, economic storage, or a hybrid practice that defies our neat categories. Across the river valley, another assemblage, low, slate-like stones laid in rows beside burial mounds, each with a shallow channel carved like a scale, forming a pattern that from a distance makes the hillside appear to ripple. This site can be teased into a single sentence that speaks of industry and belief. A communal cemetery where the living marked graves with dragon-scale stones, turning remembrance into landscape. The mounds themselves show a long sequence: primary interments with rich grave goods, ceramic bowls, bone toggles, and worked obsidian, are later overlain by simpler burials and then by marker stones. Osteological analysis from core samples suggests varied health profiles among the population. Some individuals show signs of heavy labor and healed fractures, others dental were consistent with coarse diets and complex carbohydrate reliance. Artifact distributions also suggest social differentiation. Some graves contained imported beads and bronze items, implying elites with access to long-distance exchange. Others were modest. Competing theories therefore range from the cemetery being an ancestral site of a stratified community to a shared communal ground that later groups reused with differing funerary economies. The mythic overlay is as vivid as the archaeology. Local tales claim that the stones are the fallen scales of a slumbering dragon buried below. Children are warned not to take a scale lest the dragon seek his missing armor. Imagine walking the terraced hillside at midday, sun pressing down, the scale grooves throwing thin shadows. The land here is memory turned into pattern, and pattern turned into cautionary tale. Yet for all the osteological data and artifacts spread, we still don't know whether those grooves were symbolic scales, utilitarian grooves for offerings, or pragmatic channels to funnel water from the mounds in a dry season. Not all dragon stones stand alone. Some occur in linear arrays along ridgelines that match the path of old caravan trails. One such corridor, a stretch known in some maps as the Ivory Ridge route, presents a one-sentence teaser that blends economics and enchantment. Stones with dragon heads guide travelers, their mouths carved to catch offerings from passing caravans. Surface surveys along this corridor documented an astonishing density of work stone and small shrines. Faunal remains suggest way stations where pack animals were tended. Analytical work traced certain bead styles and copper alloys back to distant workshops, indicating trade that connected these highlands not only to nearby plains but in networks that reached maritime routes. Some scholars read the mouths carved into stones as practical repositories where travelers left coins, food, or notes asking favors of local spirits. Others see them as ritualized waymarks, stones that fed the protective spirit of the route to ensure safe passage. More fanciful accounts speak of dragons who guarded trade secrets and exacted fees in the form of soul coin, an image that medieval scribes loved and modern folk retell with relish. Picture yourself bending over a shallow mouth in the stone, leaving a ribbon or a scrap of bread, and then stepping back as the wind closes the ribbon around your wrist. It is an embodied way of making promises across distance and time. Still, for all the bead chemistry and the distribution maps, we still don't know whether these mouths were practical caches, ritual altars for the safe conduct of traders, or both intertwined in ways that changed across centuries. Finally, in this installment, there's a cluster of low-relief panels hammered into river-smooth boulders in a narrow gorge, each panel depicting what appears to be a procession of human figures followed by elongated serpentine bodies, an image that can be reduced to one leading line, carved river stones that seem to show ritual procession and the joining of human and dragon forms. A micro-excavation above the gorge found traces of lacquered pigments and a translucent resin used in binding, substances that suggest intentional preservation and a long ritual life for these stones. Strontium isotope analysis of human teeth from burial contexts nearby indicates childhood mobility for several individuals, supporting a narrative of itinerant groups or intermarriage among distant communities. Interpretations diverge. Some scholars take the procession as a literal depiction of historical events, communal migrations, funerary processions, or conquest parades, while others read the fusion of human and serpent as symbolic of shamanic practices, where individuals took on the attributes of animals during ritual transgression. Mythic retellings, inevitably, make the procession the march of the ancients, giants moving like rivers, their tails leaving stone scar patterns on the land. Picture yourself standing against the gorge wall, the river muttering below as light slices through the spray, reading a procession that was carved by hands that had seen comets and plagues and long summers. You are tracing the line between depiction and prescription. Still, for all the pigment residues and isotopic data, we still don't know whether these panels record memory, enact initiation, or encode mythology in a form meant to be read by only a few. We have now entered the territory where scientific instruments and human storytelling overlap and bicker. In these first chapters we have touched on terrace circles, defensive slabs, cave altars, funerary scales, caravan mouths, and procession panels, each an element of a broader ritual landscape that some call the dragon stones. The stones are not homogeneous. They differ in scale, orientation, craftsmanship, and context. What unites them, however, is a persistent pattern. People repeatedly invested these stones with meaning. They were focal points for memory, boundary, and exchange. They were interfaces, places where the animate and inanimate converse through offerings, carvings, and the placement of bodies. The petrological analysis shows stones chosen for resonance and durability. The spatial distribution suggests a deliberate network rather than opportunistic placements. Yet, even as physical evidence accumulates, interpretive gaps remain yawning. Are the dragons literal totems, allegorical guardians, or pragmatic markers that accrued myth and later retellings? Were the rituals designed to bind social groups together, to mark territorial claims, to placate a capricious environment, or to commemorate migrations and marriages? The competing theories are not mutually exclusive. Ritual can hold all those things at once. What matters is that the stones, simple geological entities, were made into social technology. They measured time, mediated relationships, and asserted continuity in a world of seasonal change. Before we move deeper into the other sites, pause with me for a reflective breath. The dragon stones ask us to acknowledge an inconvenient truth. Human beings have always needed to anchor themselves with stories and objects. Where the land is ambiguous, where weather shifts, where resources ebb, the community builds. The dragonstone complexes of Armenia, whether 6,000 years old or perpetually recarved, show a people who repeatedly decided that some things deserve permanence. Whether that permanence was political, spiritual, or mnemonic, the act of carving and placing stone marked a decision to remember. That decision itself is our inheritance. And with that inheritance comes responsibility, to interpret carefully, to admit uncertainty, and to listen to the echoes of the living tradition that still circles these stones. We will return to more sites, more theories, and more voices, but for now imagine the stones themselves not as mute relics but as interlocutors, insisting that we approach with humility, curiosity, and the stubborn desire to keep asking. You follow the map of stone and story into narrower valleys, and there you encounter a cluster of low-humped menhirs set like the teeth of a broken comb along an ancient terrace road. Each stone bears a different incision pattern, from crude notches to fine, almost calligraphic curls. The single-sentence tease is unavoidable. These stones seem to encode names and numbers as well as images, counting people, seasons, or debts. When archaeologists returned to these hummock terraces, they found compacted pathways between the stones, clear evidence of repeated foot traffic, plus hearths tucked behind particular markers and an astonishing range of ceramic types that change as the terrace widens into a plateau. Radiocarbon evidence from charred seeds and bones suggests episodic use spanning at least a millennium, with various phases of intensive activity followed by quieter intervals. Microwear studies on the stones show polishing in certain grooves, perhaps from hands or ropes. Chemical traces in the polished striations hint at oils and plant resins, the kinds of residues that come from practical use as well as devotional handling. Scholars argue about what was being counted. One argument reads the notches as tally marks, an administrative technology for quantifying livestock, tribute, or calendrical cycles. Another sees them as mnemonic prompts for recited genealogies, stones that were read aloud by elders to maintain social memory. A third interpretation notes that the variation in incision depth and positioning matches known marks of ownership found on metalwork from other regions and proposes that these grooves were brand-like, signaling property and allegiance. Folk memory adds a different layer. Elders still retell a tale of a traveler who lost his way until he left a notch on a stone and found it later turned into a dragon's scale, a token of passage that offers protection. Picture yourself trailing along the terrace road at sunset, feeling the stone's edges under your palm, imagining hands centuries earlier doing the exact same motion, marking, memorizing, binding persons to place. And yet, for all these microstratigraphic data and ethnographic echoes, we still don't know whether the notches were bookkeeping devices, memory aids, or the first gestures of a proto-writing system whose grammar we can no longer hear. Walk from administration to metallurgy, and you find a surprisingly well-preserved smelting pit set adjacent to a ring of dragon-engraved stones. A one-line synopsis that surprises the utilitarian and sacred alike. Early metalworking occurred in direct relationship to ritual monuments. Excavation here revealed slag lenses, tuyeres fragments, and a small cache of crucible fragments next to a slab that shows a dragon motif with a missing eye, perhaps deliberately removed as part of a smelting ritual. Radiometric dates on charcoal from the furnace bottoms place the activity squarely in the late Chalcolithic to early Bronze transition, a period of technological flux. Trace element analysis of the slag ties the ore to local deposits, but isotopic signatures on a handful of finished copper pieces show affinities with ore sources further afield, indicating not only local production but participation in long-distance metallurgical exchange. Some researchers argue that the co-location of smelting and carved stone implies ritual production. Metal was not merely produced for tools and weapons but was ritually charged in the presence of ancestral or protective stones. Metal as gift or as medium of transference between worlds. Another suggestion frames the stones as territorial markers ensuring that the control of production, and therefore political power, remained in the hands of certain lineages. A third hypothesis proposes that the dragon imagery specifically denotes metallurgical knowledge, which some traditions associate with chthonic or subterranean powers, dragons that dwell where ore sleeps. Imagine yourself crouched by the cooling slag, heat in your face, and the dragon-etched slab watching like an overseer of craft and oath, the smell of burnt minerals and human breath braided together. Still, for all the metallurgical chemistry and spatial patterning, we still don't know whether the stones sanctified the forge, legitimized elite control, or symbolized hidden geological agency. Move now to the margins where Christianity later layered new meanings atop older stones. Here the single sentence hook sounds like a paradox. Dragon stones were not erased but repurposed, reinscribed by crosses, wrapped in votive cloth, baptized into new stories. Medieval scribes and builders frequently carved crosses into standing stones, attached icons nearby, or incorporated them into church foundations. Sometimes the dragon motif was left intact and simply interpreted as a pagan element now rendered harmless by Christian rites. Archaeologists find, in several such spots, a palimpsest of ritual. Beneath a Christian foundation, pre-Christian offerings persist. Above, a cemetery reuses the stone layout but alters grave orientation to match Christian norms. This continuity within change raises complex questions about conversion as negotiation rather than annihilation. One school views the reuse as strategic appropriation by ecclesiastical authorities seeking to harness long-standing sacred geography to legitimate newer practices. Another reads it as popular resistance, local communities maintaining ancestral rites under the cover of new ritual grammar. Still another framework interprets the overlay as organic syncretism, beliefs and practices braided together over generations until the distinctions blurred into everyday life. The mythic register, predictably rich, pictures saints and dragons in uneasy alliance, tales of a saint who tamed the dragonstones and turned them into boundary markers for monastic lands, or of hermits who subsisted by sleeping in the dragon's shadow while reciting psalms to temper the old spirits. Picture yourself in a thin-walled church built of stone that predates the altar, sunlight slanting through a slit window and catching on a dragon scale carved into a reused lintel. Here, history feels like a set of thresholds, one practice stepping into another while the stones remain, accumulated with scars and new names. And yet, for all the stratigraphy and textual notes, we still don't know how deeply the old rituals persisted. Were they maintained under the radar, folded into Christian hospitalities, or erased in many places while surviving in others? We can't ignore the experimental side. Replicative archaeology has given us a way to touch the past with our hands and measure the plausibility of long-held hypotheses. Teams have reconstructed small-scale dragonstone carvings and set up experimental offerings to understand where patterns and residue chemistry. One lab found that the types of oils and fats used in libations leave residues that mimic those identified on certain real dragonstones, supporting the ritual handling thesis. Experimental astronomers have taken the measured azimuths of several stone alignments and projected them against reconstructed night skies. Some alignments conservatively match seasonal rising points of major stars and lunar standstills, while others produce ambiguous results that could be either astronomical markers or chance alignments born of topography. Ethnographers working with contemporary ritual practitioners in the region have recorded forms of procession and offering that, while not identical, echo behaviors inferred from the archaeological record, binding ribbons around stones, leaving food, and reciting petitionary phrases to place spirits. Yet experimental archaeology is not a magic key. Replication shows what is possible, not necessarily what was intended. Scholars caution that functional plausibility does not equal cultural intent. Imagine yourself hammering a fresh groove into a quarried block, standing back, trying to feel the gravity of a hand-carved eye or the tension of a chisel strike across centuries. It's a humbling exercise, one that insists on methodical patience. Still, for all replicated residues and modeled skyscapes, we still don't know the minds behind the tools. Experimental fit helps us narrow possibilities, but cannot read intention. And then there's the question of scale and social organization, the one-sentence condensation being: who organized the labor to place and maintain these stones, and what social machinery made ritual durable? Some dragonstone complexes are small and intimate, easily constructed by extended households. Others are massive undertakings suggesting coordinated labor, perhaps under the control of emergent elites or priestly specialists. Settlement surveys around several large complexes reveal patterns of aggregation. Clusters of houses, storage pits, and middens suggest a central place that attracted seasonal and permanent populations. Material distributions indicate craft specialization in some locales, pottery workshops, flint knapping areas, bone tool production, that imply economic complexity. One theory proposes that ritual scenes acted as social glue, public displays and communal rites orchestrated by leaders to legitimize power and redistribute wealth. Another sees a more distributed model: ritual as cooperative technology enacted by kin groups to manage resources and resolve disputes. The mythic imaginations favor grand narratives: lost chiefs who marshaled entire valleys to lift monoliths, or secret brotherhoods of initiates who moved stones like chess pieces to chart cosmological maps. Picture yourself arriving at a large plaza bordered by dragonstones, hearing the hum of people, smelling smoke and simmering meat. Civic life and ritual life merge into a single rhythm where status and obligation are lived rather than recorded. Still, for all settlement patterns and craft evidence, we still don't know the precise mechanisms of organization, whether centralized coercion or distributed consensus held these communities together. Across these strands, a pattern emerges as much as a problem. Dragonstones are simultaneously local and networked, utilitarian and sacred, resisted and assimilated. They are technologies of memory, devices for negotiation, and catalysts for imagination too large to be contained by any single explanatory model. When you stand at one of these stones, you encounter a condensed biography of human action: quarrying, carving, offering, repairing, erasing, and retelling. Each gesture adds a layer. Each layer refracts the past into new shapes. The stone's persistence across epochs, through metallurgy and market, through the spread of new religions and the ebb of empires, tells of durable landscapes of practice. It also tells us how dangerous it is to seek single answers. The past was messy, recursive, and adaptive. So as you picture these valleys, the fog, the shepherds, the children with their stone games, remember the stones are interlocutors in a long conversation about who we are, how we bind with place, and what we owe to those who came before. Keep that image: hands tracing grooves, flames licking the understone, a choir of voices calling names at dawn. We will continue to follow the stones, interrogate new data, and listen to old stories, because each site adds a new facet to the question at the heart of everything we've already explored. Were these dragon stones primarily rituals made physical, myths that organized action, or both at once? We will keep pressing the edges of that question, because the stones do not allow us to stop asking. Walk with me now to where water still shapes the stone, because some of the most telling dragonstones sit where rivers breathe against rock. Flat slabs smoothed by centuries of flow, and then incised with shallow channels and spiral mouths that catch the first rain. A single sentence tease fits like a coin in a hand. These stones seem to have been made to drink, collecting rain, channeling it, consecrating it. The patterns carved into their surfaces are not random. They guide droplets into basins and from basins into carved gutters that lead to planted hollows. At one such site, a sequence of linked stones forms a gutter system that traverses a small spring meadow. Archaeologists who took careful cross-sections of the underlying soils found pollen sequences suggesting deliberate plantings of wetland species, reeds, sedges, and water-loving herbs, planted in phase 2 of use, after an initial phase of solely stone modification. Radiocarbon from redimbricated deposits dates to a mid-Neolithic horizon, with later Bronze Age refurbishments. Ethnobotanical analyses indicate these wetland plants were not random. Some species have medicinal or ritual properties in oral traditions across the highlands, used in childbirth, healing, and purification rites. Now, let's be fair, water is practical. Channels can irrigate, basins can store, but the placement of carved motifs, eyelid-like ridges, tooth-like teeth facing uphill, offerings basins ringed by miniature engraving, suggests a ritual logic layered atop hydraulic function. One theory reads these as proto-hydraulic installations where ritual and agriculture co-evolved, careful management of water bolstered subsistence, and simultaneously became sacramental. Another suggests these were not economic at all but sacrificial. Water redirected through dragon mouths would carry offerings to subterranean spirits, gifts delivered where priests could not go. Still another frames them as pilgrimage installations, stations of a ritual route where people came to bathe, pour libations, and recite communal vows. Mythic narratives, vivid in village memory, speak of a time when the rivers ran with milk and the dragonstones drank first. Elders sing of healing rites where ailing children were washed at dawn in the gutter of a dragon's jaw, then wrapped in reeds for the blessings to take hold. Picture yourself at daybreak, standing in a shallow hollow as water moves around your ankles, listening as the stones detail the soft language of moving liquid. The scene collapses utility and devotion into one, hands washing, prayers muttered, the stones' carved mouths swallowing both water and a whispered plea. Still, for all the pollen cores and hydrological modeling, we still don't know whether these installations began as practical waterworks later sanctified, or as sacred sites whose ritual logic mandated the engineering of water itself. From wet stones to sky stones, consider next the alignments that stubbornly refuse to be dismissed as coincidence. Stretching along a low ridge are a handful of dragonhead slabs, each tilted slightly, each whose carved snout points to a horizon notch where, on solstices and equinoxes, light slices in a particular way. A concise hook, the stones are timekeepers, calendars written in rock. Field teams mapped azimuths and elevations with the patience of watchmakers. Using horizon profiles, archaeostratigraphers reconstructed past sidelines, accounting for isostatic shifts and vegetational cover. A number of alignments correspond to solar events with a precision that is hard to attribute to chance. Yet here's where it gets tricky: not all alignments are consistent. Some stones point to lunar standstills, others to mountain notches that align only irregularly with celestial events when the precessional drift is factored in. One interpretation holds that these were multi-purpose markers, seasonal calendars tied to pastoral cycles, rims for sowing and shearing, encoded into a landscape of migration. Another posits a ritual calendar used by a priestly caste to orchestrate feasts and funerary rituals that synchronized with the sky, an early ecclesiastical timetable before institutional religion. A more skeptical view cautions against imposing astronomical intentionality. Human perception is pattern-loving. Given enough stones and a wide horizon, you will find matches. But it is seductive to imagine the night watch, elders, torchlight, breath visible in cold air, learning to read the notch where a star rises and, along with it, when to move herds or when to store seed. Picture yourself standing in the cold of pre-dawn, breath clouding, a line of ancient teeth pointing like the hands of a clock toward an unseen sun. There is a logic there, and it speaks of people who moved by time, who scheduled life not by arbitrary counting but by the choreography of light and shadow. Still, for all the measured azimuths and astronomical fits, we still don't know whether the alignments were crafted primarily to measure time, to consecrate sacred moments, or to anchor mythic narratives into the slow turning of the heavens. We then come to the stones associated with childbirth and lineage, a cluster of small, hand-sized slabs often found near house foundations, each bearing tiny dragon eyes and coiled tails. Their one-line tease is intimate. These are stones people touched when life began. Excavations around domestic hearths show these touchstones were buried with newborns, tethered to crib posts, or carried in the pocket of a midwife. Residue and microwear analyses revealed traces of hair, oils, and ochre, consistent with ritual anointing. Osteological samples from infant burials show unusual caries frequencies and stress markers that suggest high infant mortality but also attentive care, evidence of communities battling harsh landscapes while investing heavily in child survival. One theory sees the touchstones as apotropaic charms, materialized prayers meant to ward off infant death in precarious early months. Another, more structural interpretation frames them as part of an elaborate system of kinship tokens, objects that encoded lineage claims and were passed between families during marriage alliances or dispute settlements. Folk memory colors these interpretations with fierce tenderness. Mothers still tell of burying a little dragon near the threshold when a baby was born, and of the child who later returned to the stone and whispered its secrets. Picture yourself at twilight, holding a small carved pebble between thumb and forefinger, feeling the worn smoothness where generations of palms passed over it. Here, the monument shrinks to the size of a palm and stretches to the size of an entire life's commitments. Still, for all the microwear evidence and burial contexts, we still don't know whether these stones function mainly as protective charms, symbols of kinship, or both woven into a domestic ritual tapestry. Next, cross into the realm of transgression and initiation. Scattered at the margins of several dragonstone complexes are secluded hollows where the carvings are deliberately defaced, eyes scratched out, maws filled with mortar, scales hammered flat. A single-sentence teaser frames it starkly: some stones were punished. In certain ethnographic parallels, defacement signals ritual closure, the termination of a dangerous site, or even the reappropriation of a power once held by rival groups. Archaeology shows patterns. Defacement episodes often coincide with abrupt shifts in material culture, new pottery styles, different dietary profiles, or evidence of influxes from other regions. One interpretation sees this as conquest iconoclasm. Conquering groups vandalize the monuments of the defeated to assert dominance. Another reads the damage as ritual decommissioning, stones killed, in order to retire their power when the social contract that sustained them faltered. There's also the possibility of contagion theory. Stones associated with disease were defaced to quarantine their agency. Oral traditions do not lack for violence. One tale tells of a brave youth who blinded a dragon stone to avenge a plague that took his kin. while another recounts elders who sealed a stone's mouth to stop the voices that once lured youths into the caves. Picture yourself crouched in a hollow, seeing a scarred eye and feeling the awkward intimacy of a culture that could both revere and wound its sacred objects. Objects that, after all, were human-made and therefore vulnerable to human politics. Still, for all the stratigraphic disturbances and ceramic breaks, we still don't know whether defacement primarily marks conquest, ritual retirement, or a complex mixture of both. We should not forget the tactile economies that intersect with the stones, the beads, textiles, and metal finds that cluster in their shadows. At one riverside site, a trap of small glass beads and carnelian pendants lay lodged in a rock crevice beside a dragon mouth. Analysis shows the beads' chemical fingerprint matching manufacturers from distant coastal workshops, and some beads carry drill marks consistent with the use of hand-powered bow drills. These small things, so often dismissed as trivial, are the threads connecting the dragon stones to a mobile world of exchange. Trade routes appear like veins in the landscape, and the stones are often placed at the junctions where networks crossed. Interpretations diverge. Were the stones a means to regulate trade, places where merchants swore oaths and left guarantees, or were they markers of hospitality, signaling a safe place to rest and exchange goods? A mythic reading turns them into the dragon's hoard, a place where travelers left tokens to pay passage in a world where money as we know it did not yet exist. Picture yourself kneeling, untangling a string of tiny beads from a rock crevice, each bead a story compressed into a chip of color. Here the global touches the local. The stranger's bead becomes a child's charm, a bride's dowry, a votive offering. Still, for all the compositional trace analyses and cross-regional comparisons, we still don't know the degree to which the stones functioned as economic regulators, as ritual hospices, or as something that held both roles that shifted over time. Finally, in this stretch, consider the performative aspects, the songs, gestures, and communal movements tied to stones that rarely leave a trace in the soil but echo in memory. Chroniclers from later periods recorded ritual songs that mention dragons and thresholds, and modern ethnography records laments and work songs that, while not direct copies of prehistoric chant, carry structural echoes, call and response patterns, refrain lines, and the repeated invoking of place names. Performance is ephemeral yet formative. People moving together around a stone creates social cohesion that persists long after the gestures fade. One theoretical approach focuses on the stones as stages for political theater. Leaders used ritual performance to dramatize power relations, redistribute wealth, and rehearse cosmology. Another emphasizes the stones as mnemonic anchors for oral histories, sonically and physically linking words and gestures so the past could be carried forward without written records. The mythic imagination supplies dramatic flourishes, processions that wake sleeping stones, songs that coax rainfall, dances that bind couples and territories. Picture yourself stepping into a circle of dancers, hands linked, voice rising at dusk. There is an intimacy to the ritual that resists reduction to mere symbolism. Still, for all the literary notations and comparative ethnography, we still don't know the exact content of those vanished songs, nor the degree to which performance shaped the stone's meaning versus simply accompanying it. Each of these pathways, water and sky, birth and defacement, trade and performance, demonstrates a recurring truth: dragon stones are polyvalent. They are not single-purpose artifacts but sites where multiple human concerns intersect. When you stand with them, you realize that our categories, ritual, economy, politics, myth, are modern lenses we bring to a past that lived them together. The archaeological record offers fragments, dates, residues, isotopes, but the human imagination supplies the connective tissue. It is tempting, and sometimes necessary, to choose a dominant interpretation to structure narratives, yet the stones themselves suggest a more web-like model of meaning. They tell us that communities indefinitely braided subsistence and ceremony, production and memory, into material forms that could be seen, touched, and used. As you imagine the valleys at dusk, smoke from hearths, children chasing the falling light, elders tracing grooves, you feel the thick texture of continuity. And because the stones invite stories, they also invite our curiosity to be humble, to weigh evidence, to appreciate imagination, and to accept that certain answers may remain morally, and intellectually out of reach. We still don't know, but we keep listening, keeping our hands ready to feel the cool of carved stone and our ears open to the stories the landscape will whisper. Beneath the frozen gaze of another ridge, there is a long, low platform where dozens of small dragon stones are set like a broken coronet. A single line will do. This is a communal stage where collective memory was performed and renewed. The platform sits above an old village terrace, its stones aligned to face a valley where the sun pools at noon. When archaeologists cleared the topsoil, they found a dense scatter of broken bowls and small figurines, soot-rimmed stones used for grinding, and a ring of post holes that once held the uprights of a temporary structure, perhaps a canopy for seasonal congregation. Radiocarbon from hearth deposits gives a long sequence of reuse from the late Neolithic into the Iron Age, while pollen trapped in hearth sediments suggests that ritual feasting involved barley and wild fruits preserved in particular ways. Some of the carved dragon stones here are elaborated with miniature notches and pecked lines that mimic the tufting on animal hides. Others bear the faint traces of pigment in red and black, barely visible unless angled under a strong light. One interpretation sees this platform as an agora of ritual performance, an open stage where elders staged myths, recited genealogies, and enforced social norms. Another suggests a civic function. Leaders use spectacle to redistribute resources, reconcile disputes, and rehearse seasonal obligations. A third reads the platform as an educational arena for initiates, where scholarly and practical knowledge, breeding livestock, reading star calendars, or reciting law, was transmitted in performative form. The mythic layer is generous. Some stories insist that this coronet of stones once hosted a contest among the valley's champions, with the strongest pulling a dragon tooth from the platform to prove worth, while other tales whisper of secret nights when the stones glowed and spoke the names of ancestors. Picture yourself joining a crowd there at the waning of a long summer day, the smell of stew and ash, the sound of a child's laugh as an elder whispers a name. In that moment, ritual, law, and play are braided into a single human event. Still, for all the material distribution and contextual data, we still don't know whether the performances were primarily political theater, sacred pedagogy, or communal entertainment that held the group together in 1,000 small ways. Not far away, in a landscape of karst and sinkholes, a peculiar set of dragonstones recline as though sleeping. Each one bears a carved incision that resembles a mouth and a handprint, thumb pressed deep into the stone. This sight teases with a one-line image of touch. These stones remember hands. Microscopic residue analysis on the hand impressions recovered traces of oils, ochre, and plant emulsions. The residues match compounds used in local midwifery and in leather tanning. The hand-impressed stones cluster around springs and trail junctions, frequently adjacent to napping stations and temporary shelters. Some archaeologists see them as markers of oath-taking, places where hands were laid to attest to promises, to seal alliances, or to swear fealty. The persistence of a hand motif across many cultures gives this hypothesis plausibility. Others read the hand marks as markers for craft transmission, masters pressing their identity into the landscape near their workplace, claiming both product and place. Local tales romanticize the touch. If you press your palm into the same groove, an elder once told a visiting fieldwork student, and whisper your child's name, the stone will hold it until the child returns. Imagine yourself leaning there with your palm cupped around that hollow, your skin remembering other palms that once pressed there, each press a contract, a blessing, or a small grief transformed into a durable mark. Still, for all the residue chemistry and spatial clustering, we still don't know whether these stones were legal instruments, craft signatures, or domestic shrines for everyday vows and sorrows. On a windswept headland overlooking a basin where migratory birds wheel in autumn, another set of dragonstones presents a single-sentence question. These are the stones of passage, markers along routes of movement that map seasons, marriages, and migrations. In places where the topography funneled human movement, the stones act like signposts, small, repeatable motifs carved at eye level to guide shepherds and caravans. Survey mapping shows that many such stones align with paleo-channels and ancient hoofprints that, when modeled against climatic reconstructions, would have been wetter in the past, ideal corridors for spring migration. Artifacts scattered along these routes reveals not only the practical remains of travel, broken harness fittings, rations containers, and spindle whorls, but also votive deposits, strings of sewn beads, scraps of cloth, and tokens left by travelers asking for safe passage. One interpretation frames these stones as pragmatic waymarks overlaid with ritual practice. Another reads them as liminal protectors, threshold guardians who held the border between one kin group's grazing rights and another's territory. Mythic accounts dramatize them as the footprints of dragon guardians who once shepherded human flocks between high pastures. Marriage songs still mention leaving a token at the third dragon stone to ensure fertility and fidelity. Picture yourself walking a narrow ridge, the sky wide above and a thin ribbon of trail ahead, stopping at each carved signpost to knot a ribbon or leave a seed. Your movement becomes a liturgy, your trail a text written in stone. Still, for all the topographic modeling and material traces, we still don't know whether these stones primarily choreographed movement, mediated disputes, or simply accrued rituals to soothe the dangers of crossing. Near an abandoned stronghold, hidden in a fold of the land, there is a cluster of dragon stones that uniquely integrate human portraiture. Faces with elongated snouts, human eyes, and bodies decorated like tunics. A single line tease that complicates species. These stones blur human and dragon into hybrid forms. Iconographic analysis suggests different hands at work. Some faces are rendered with naturalistic depth, others are stylized, almost schematic. The hybrids occur in contexts rich with burials that show grave goods indicating status differentiation, ornate pins, decorated helmets, and imported glass, but also with signs of household crafts and children's toys. One interpretation reads the hybrids as ancestor portraits, human leaders represented with dragon attributes to symbolize power, longevity, or a claim to divine favor. Another suggests ritual roleplay, initiates or shamans donning dragon attributes during ceremonies, leaving a kind of photographic memory carved in stone. Ethnohistoric parallels speak of ritual masquerade and animal person hybrids as a widespread mode of performance, making the shamanic reading attractive. Mythic lore, naturally, tells of a time when the boundary between human and beast thinned, kings who could sprout wings by night, brides who carried dragon children across winter. Picture yourself standing before such a carving, the face looking back with the unsettling intimacy of an ancestor who is also an emblem. The stone presses you into a question of identity and claim. Who is allowed to speak for a people and what happens when that speech takes animal form? Still, for all the iconographic parallels and funerary contexts, we still don't know whether these hybrids were literal claims of descent, theatrical costumes, or metaphors for political ideology. In a rocky hollow where the sun hits just right, a single dragon stone bears an unusual array of small cupules, concave pits arranged in a spiral that, under ultraviolet light, reveals faint traces of pigments. The one-line tease is tactile and archaic, a counting stone that might also be an astrolabe for weather and fate. Archaeologists experimented with casting the cups to model rain accumulation and seed distribution. They also surveyed the spiral against seasonal wind patterns. Some see the cupules as a primitive counting board, used to tally livestock or days in a lunar cycle. Others posit omen reading. Rain collected in the cups and its movement, bubbles, dust, color, was interpreted by specialists to foretell harvests or disease. Mythic tales speak of a dragon's cup, where a bride's fate was poured, her future read by the ripple and the residue left after offerings. Picture yourself kneeling to peer into the cups, feeling the cool rim under your fingertips, and watching a small film of water hold the sky's color. In such a moment, you sense how small technologies of perception could be integrated into social life, turning mundane pools of water into instruments of fate. Still, for all the experimental hydrology and ethnographic analogy, we still don't know whether these cupules were pragmatic counters, divinatory tools, or a hybrid practice where calculation and omen braided together. As we wander through these stones, one conviction grows: they are not museum objects, but living architectures of human practice. They resist being reduced to a single field of study because they combine craft, economy, cosmology, and emotion in ways that modern disciplinary boundaries struggle to capture. You must imagine the builders not as static ancestors but as actors in communities responding to environmental stress, social competition, and the irrepressible need to narrate existence. In every groove, in every pressed palm, in every pigment smear, there is a human attempt to make the world legible and tolerable. These dragon stones were instruments in that work, sometimes calendars, sometimes boundary posts, sometimes shrines, sometimes signs for travelers, sometimes heirlooms, often all of these at once. And they ask us to approach with a similar plurality, to measure, to test, to narrate, and to imagine. Keep walking, keep listening, and remember that our most responsible posture toward these stones is both rigorous and open-hearted, rigorous in method, open-hearted in interpretation, because the past was full of people very much like us, balancing survival with meaning, work with wonder. When we pull all of these threads together, the terrace circles with their watchful eyes, the great dragon tooth that glares over a plateau, the cave altars that reek faintly of tannins and old ferment, the funerary scales etched into hillsides, the mouths carved to catch offerings along caravan routes, the procession panels and hybrid portraits, the water gutters and skyline teeth, the hand-impressed grooves and the counting cupules. We begin to see not a single monolithic phenomenon but a braided system of human practices folded into the living landscape. These dragon stones were not merely objects. They were nodes in a social machine that made the invisible legible. They were tools for remembering, for controlling, for pleading, for calendaring, and for performing the crucial work of social life. Standing with them is to confront a past that thought materially. People here used rock as a grammar to mark kinship, territory, and time. They carved glyphs of fear and blessing, and they braided the practical with the sacred so tightly that to pull them apart impoverishes both. Imagine, again, the fog clinging to the fields, drums at night, the slow procession of figures carved in rock whose tails ripple like rivers. Picture a child leaving a bead in the dragon's mouth at dawn. Picture an elder tracing a notch with the same thumb that once steadied a shepherd's sling. Picture a woman, lantern in hand, crouching at a cave mouth to pour out a fermented offering while the stone's carved coils drink the light. Those images are not romantic gloss. They are the functional reality of ritual as a distributed technology. Distributed, because ritual's effects flowed outward to bind markets, marriages, and mourning into a stable, legible order. Yet however integral ritual was, we must be blunt about the stubborn gaps that persist. The stones will not yield a single story. Radiocarbon dates place activities across millennia. Isotope analyses show mobility and trade networks that cross highland divides. Residue chemistry proves libations, oils, and pigments. Astronomical reconstructions produce both pattern and ambiguity. The data insist on complexity. Where one model explains a set of features, say, astronomical orientation coupled with feasting deposits, another model explains equally well economic scheduling for pasture movements that happen to be aligned with stellar cycles, or political rituals staged by elites who use spectacle to redistribute grain and cement alliances. Myth and materiality rub against each other in productive friction. Tales of giants and dragon children tell us less about paleobiology than about social size, how communities imagine power and endurance, and they tell us something vital about psychological strategies for handling grief, loss, and the unmanageable forces of nature. The sensational versions of giants and curses are not archaeological proofs. They are emblems of communal need, metaphors that compress political narrative into memorable form. To listen to those stories without imposing a modernist snort is to appreciate that myths are a kind of evidence too, evidence of how people wanted to be seen and how they wanted the world to act upon them. There is also a politics of continuity to reckon with. These landscapes did not die when new religions, new polities, and new technologies arrived. They were remade. Christianity repurposed stones, conquerors defaced them, communities reinterpreted them. Sometimes old rites were folded into new liturgies. Sometimes the stones were buried, forgotten, or pressed into foundations. The palimpsest is not only archaeological but ethical. As modern observers and stewards of heritage, we inherit responsibilities to recognize the stones both as facts about the past and as living repositories of meaning for contemporary people who trace their own identities through these carved faces. Preservation is not merely about preventing decay. It is about preserving the right of local communities to narrate and remake their heritage. When an elder insists that a particular slab is still listening to prayers, dismissing that claim with purely positivist pedantry is not only culturally tone-deaf, it risks severing the fragile social ties that bind people to their land. At the same time, romanticized heritage commodification, turning sacred sites into tourist backdrops without consent or context, threatens to hollow out the very practices that made these places meaningful. Our stewardship must balance scientific inquiry, local custodianship, and a humility about how much of the past can be definitively known. Methodologically, the dragon stones force us to be flexible. Multi-proxy approaches, combining stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, isotopic life histories, residue analysis, and experimental replication, have proven their worth in narrowing possibilities and discarding implausible claims. Yet interpretive pluralism remains necessary. There will be no final monograph that conclusively nails every carved eye's intent to a single explanation because these stones accrued uses and meanings over thousands of years. The right question is not, what did the dragon stones mean? As if meaning were singular, but how did meanings change across time and for whom? One generation might have come to a stone to swear an oath, another might have recarved it to signal a new alliance, a third might have sealed it in mortar to retire its agency. Each action is evidence of shifting social contracts. The transdisciplinary work the dragon stones demand is itself a social ritual. Excavators and elders, chemists and storytellers, students and shepherds must collaborate, each bringing their own form of listening to the rock. Emotionally, these places are capacious. They carry sorrow and triumph. They harbor the practical trivia of life and the sublime choreography of cosmology. To stand at a stone is to feel an aggregation of human time layered like lichen, the sunk thumb of a vow, the polish where countless hands smooth a groove, the echo of a song sung by torchlight, the chip where a blade sought to silence a shape. These are tactile traces of ordinary people, not just elites. The stones connect us to the continuity of small civic acts, feeding the communal hearth, attending the conscription of labor to move a slab, threading a bead into a child's dowry. They also connect us to the grander rhythms, celestial cycles, long-distance exchanges, the slow accretions of law and lineage. Both scales are true simultaneously. In that duality there is consolation. Our ancestors were not simpler than we imagine. They were complex, contradictory, pragmatic, and poetic in turns. We must also be honest about the limits of spectacle. You will always find headlines that want dragons and capitals and promises of giants in the margins, because spectacle sells. Sensational claims can bring attention, and thereby funding, to neglected sites, but they also distort research priorities and can alienate the local people whose voices are essential. Good scholarship resists the cheap thrill of the monstrous and favors careful accumulation of evidence. Good storytelling, however, does not street clean myth. It places myth as part of the narrative ecology. There is a way to honor both, to tell the human-rich story in a way that respects the technical detail without airbrushing out the spell that keeps old tales alive. After all, the need for storytelling is not evidence of ignorance. It is often a sophisticated strategy for encoding social memory in ways that survive beyond fragile records. What would progress look like then? It looks like more collaborative digs that hire and train local workers. It looks like isotope studies that track mobility in granular detail. It looks like careful residue work that can differentiate types of libation. It looks like astronomical models married to ethnographic analogs rather than speculative certainty. It looks like community-driven interpretive centers where elders can speak, students can read, and tourists can be taught not to touch what should not be touched. Progress also looks like policy that protects these sites from looting and from ill-considered development, and like academic humility that will let a stone keep some of its secrets. Above all, progress looks like dialogue, between the past and the present, between science and story, between the archaeologist and the shepherd, the poet and the chemist. In closing, the dragon stones of Armenia, those 6,000-year-old witnesses carved into valley and ridge, invite us into a practice of careful attention. They ask us to hold multiple truths, that ritual and economy are braided, that myth is a kind of historical testimony, that archaeological data are partial but powerful, and that no single interpretive lens is definitive. They show us that people before us lived in a world where stone could be a calendar, a boundary, a shrine, a ledger, a stage, a passport, and a family heirloom, all in succession, and sometimes concurrently. The final emotional payoff is not a tidy revelation but a change in how we relate to time and to material presence. When you trace a groove with your hand and feel the smoothness worn by centuries of palms, you are touching continuity. When you listen to an elder tell of the dragon who tilts his head toward the east, you are hearing myth as a living claim on place. These are moments that press on our modern assumptions. They ask us to remember that durability and meaning are manufactured, continually, by human labor and human imagination. They demand that we care enough to protect, to study, and to listen. So go to the stones if you can. Walk the foggy ridge, kneel at a mouth, rub a palm into a thumbprint and imagine the vows that were once sealed there. Taste the sharp air, watch the grains swell in the terraces that might have fed those who carved the eyes. Bring questions rather than definitive answers, respect rather than conquest. The stones will not surrender all at once, nor should they. They are kept not only by the earth but by the stories we keep telling, by the rituals we allow to continue, and by the care we show in cataloging and protecting them. Some of their meanings will never be fully deciphered, and that is as it should be. Ambiguity is the human inheritance of a long-lived landscape. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.